Searching the Scriptures with Watchman Alexander, Episode 25.
Is everybody in the world going to die before someone finds the answer?
Do I have to remind you that theory is the beginning of solution?
What are we up against? Is it a dangerous thing?
All I've ever known to be true is a lie.
I didn't say it would be easy. I just said it would be the truth. I believe this is going to be our finest hour.
Welcome to Searching the Scriptures with Watchman Alexander, where we break away from religious systems and man-made dogma to learn the Word of God from an independent Hebraic perspective. And now your host, the prophecy buff who tackles the tough stuff, Alexander Lawrence.
Hello and shalom. The hour is late, the time is short, and the storm is coming. So this is your opportunity for a systems check. I'm here to wake up the sleeping servants of Yahweh God and equip them for the last days. I do that by teaching discernment, poring over prophecies, treating the infection of Mystery Babylon in the church, and giving you courage. My website is watchmanalexander.com, and I have an electronic newsletter that you can sign up for there. So it's been a very busy few weeks. I'm sorry I've been away, but we are going to be finishing up our study about the Sabbath today. This is episode 3 of 3 in the Sabbath series. I hope you're looking forward to that. But before we get started, I want to let you know about my current project. If you haven't already heard or seen, I'm running a Kickstarter right now for my new novel, Reign of the Rebel. Reign of the Rebel is historical fiction about the fall of Babel and the rise of Nimrod. It follows the life of one hero who must risk everything to stop the demigod giant, Nimrod, from controlling the world. It's actually only the first in a series of 6 books that I have planned, 3 of which will be set in the ancient world, 3 of which will be set in the near future. And what's going to tie the 2 trilogies together is going to be the man of perdition, man of lawlessness, also known as the Antichrist. I would say that I'm pulling a George Lucas, but the first trilogy is actually set in the past instead of in the future. It's it's going to be in chronological order, so it's not really like Star Wars, but still, 2 trilogies, 2 sets of movies. One can dream. I do hope to at least have Reign of the Rebel and the other books turned into graphic novels, but that's still, a ways off. So first things first, I've got to get Reign of the Rebel published. So please go check out the Kickstarter, and you can read the first 4 chapters for free right now. You can also listen to them. They're in audio format. I'm going to leave a link to the Kickstarter in the show notes, but you can also just go find it by navigating to kickstarter.com. And once you're there, you can do a search for either my name, Alexander Lawrence, or the name of the book, Reign of the Rebel. R-E-I-G-N, reign, like a king reigns, Reign of the Rebel. Either one of those searches will take you to the page. Should be very easy to find. And then the links in the campaign tab will take you to the different chapters. I hope you enjoy the chapters, and if you do, pass them around for me. So today we're going to be talking about how we keep the Sabbath. What exactly does it mean to be Sabbath keepers? However, I realized since our last episode that there were a couple of passages which I really wanted to talk about, but didn't get around to it. So I want to spend some time on those 2 passages now because they both relate to the end of the age. Yes, the Sabbath is mentioned in 2 eschatological prophecies, both of which came right out of the mouth of Messiah. The first one is something he said during the Olivet Discourse. So flip to Matthew 24 and go down to verse 15. And there we read, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved." So you probably caught it, but I'll just read verse 20 again. "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." Let's start out by establishing the audience here. Who is Yeshua talking to? Well, this is the Olivet Discourse. He's talking to his disciples, and thus to all of us, because we're disciples that would be made by those first disciples. So we're all really clumped into this group of people that he's talking to. His advice is to his followers. He wants them to be protected as much as possible in the last days. So he's giving prophetic warnings that the disciples who were listening at the time were not going to need, but the disciples at the very end of the age certainly will need. Now, if any preterists are listening, they would object to what I just said. They would say, no, this was all fulfilled in 70 AD, well, circa 70 AD. And my response to that would be, oh, really? I'm sorry, but there's no way you're going to convince me that the Roman destruction of Jerusalem was the greatest tribulation to ever befall? No, that's simply not the case. It was awful, yes, but it was not the worst tribulation that the world has ever seen. This tribulation that Yeshua is talking about will be worldwide martyrdom. It will be persistent persecution of Yeshua's people for 3.5 years. What happened in 70 AD was a localized event, and cities have been sieged over and over again throughout history. Some cities have been terribly annihilated. Was what happened to Jerusalem extreme? Yeah, absolutely. But it wasn't the kind of great, widespread tribulation that Yeshua is talking about here. That's why he immediately proceeds to talk about his second coming, because this event of the abomination of desolation being set up in the temple is only 3.5 years before the end when he returns. We're not talking about an event that was 2,000 years before his second advent. Okay, so now that we've established that, why is he saying that we should pray that our flight is not in the winter or on the Sabbath? Note that he's talking to those in Judea. He says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So this instruction is not to all of his followers everywhere. It's to those who are within the proximity of the temple, where the man of perdition is going to cause desolation and set up an idol of himself as an abomination in the temple. The persecution is going to start from right there. That's why people need to flee immediately when they see this. The fact that he says, don't go back for anything, establishes for us that the disciples will need to move very quickly to get out of there. Haste is going to be required. That's why it's going to be a problem for pregnant women and those who have infants at that time, because those things really slow a person down. So because people are going to need to get out of there quickly, it's important that they not be traveling in the winter. The winter oftentimes brings inclement weather. And if you haven't had time to go back and grab your cloak, you're going to be really cold if you had to flee in the middle of the winter. I think that's pretty understandable, but why does he say, pray that it's not going to be on a Sabbath? I mean, really, what does that matter? It's not like we can't run for our lives on a Sabbath. That's silliness, so that can't be the answer. And I've heard some people say, well, maybe because things are shut down on the Sabbath, those who are fleeing won't be able to get resources like gas. And that's a little bit more reasonable of an argument, but if you're not allowed to even turn around and go back to get your cloak, are you really going to have time to stop and grab resources like that? I don't think so. My guess as to what he means is this. I think that at that time in the future, all of the Jewish people are going to be keeping the Sabbath again. I think Israel is going to get really shaken up by World War III, but God is going to protect them in the midst of it. Psalm 83 might be a prophecy about part of that time period, but Ezekiel 38 certainly is one of those prophecies that lets us know that God is going to supernaturally protect Israel from invading armies. And in that oracle, he says, then they will know I am Yahweh. So what's going to happen? I think there's going to be a spiritual awakening for all of those nominal Jews and secular Jews that are living in the Holy Land. I think that most people are going to end up turning back to the Torah. I think they're going to suddenly support the rebuilding of a third temple. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if this national resurgence of faith in Yahweh leads to them tearing down the Dome of the Rock and pushing the Muslims off of the Temple Mount. In any case, I just get the sense from a number of different Old Testament prophecies, and I don't know that there's anything that's super direct, but I just get the sense that Israel is going to return to trying to keep the laws. And what that means is No one's going to be on the roads on the Sabbaths. There aren't going to be any travelers that the escapees can blend in with. If they have to flee on Sabbath, they're going to be wide open. How easy would it be for the beast's forces to then hunt down those people that are fleeing, because they'll easily be able to identify, hey, these people who are hoofing it out of Judea are the ones that don't want to cooperate. The other passage I want to take a look at is a parable that's found in the book of Luke. Turn to Luke chapter 15 and start at verse 8. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost. Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. What's this parable about? It's about a sinner who repents. That's the context that we need to have in mind as we try to interpret this parable. Until I became Torah observant, I never understood this parable. Now it makes perfect sense. First of all, let's let the Bible interpret itself. What is the silver? Psalm 12:6 says, The words of Yahweh are pure words, like silver refined in a furnace. Yahweh's words are like silver. Did you know that the 10 Commandments are actually called 10 words? In Hebrew, the word for commandments is davar, and davar just means words. So it's not actually the 10 instructions that Moses received on the mountain, it's the 10 words. And those words are like silver. So that's possibly the interpretation. Let's plug it into the parable and see if it makes sense. Reading again from verse 8. Or what woman, having 10 words from God, if she loses one word, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, Rejoice with me, for I have found the word that I had lost. Remember that at the beginning of this series, I told you that of all the 10 commandments, only one of them has been tossed out by mainstream Christianity? Christians hold to 9 of the 10 commandments. There's only one that's been lost. That's the one silver coin in this parable. When the woman rediscovers it, she calls everybody together and tells them about it, just like I'm doing right now. I want you to rejoice with me because I have rediscovered the Sabbath. It's a part of obeying God just like the rest. No wonder there's joy before the angels of God over one sinner who finds that missing coin. Isn't that something? I mean, can you think of any other interpretation that really makes sense? This fits perfectly. I'm 100% confident that Yeshua was prophesying that the 4th commandment would be lost, and that eventually it would be brought back to light and people would begin talking about it again. They would call together their friends and neighbors and say, hey, we've got to do this. And that, my friends, is a sinner repenting. Okay, now we can finally talk about how to keep the Sabbath. Hopefully by now you've been convinced that it's something that you should be doing, but how do you do it? There's still disagreement within the Torah observant community of exactly how this should be done. Part of the problem is that the command itself is a little bit vague. There's not a lot to it. That's actually a good thing. God wanted to keep it simple for our sakes. His yoke is light. He doesn't want to overburden us with lots of stipulations. So it's a pretty simple command. Let me read it to you again to refresh your memory. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the slave born in your household, and the alien as well, may be refreshed. So we're not to labor, and we're not to make any other person or animal labor on that day. But that's not all. There's another passage we need to read about the Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. Let me just point out that the Hebrew word there for a solemn rest is Shabbaton. So the Hebrew actually says a Shabbat of Shabbaton. This is not just any kind of rest. This is rest that is set apart as being sacred. And then going on to the next phrase, we read a holy convocation, and holy there is kodesh, or set apart. So we're to hold a set apart gathering or convocation. And as part of the command, that's not something that we should be neglecting. So are you neglecting to meet with other believers on the Sabbath? Then you're not doing it right. Yes, you can meet with believers on any other day as well. You can have a worship ceremony, a kodesh gathering on any day. That's perfectly fine. But you need to make sure that on the Sabbath in particular, you're participating in a worship service. And that right there is where things start to get a little bit sticky for some people, because they say, well, we have to travel to get to a gathering. And being that we're spread out these days, for the most part, we have to drive in cars, some significant distance to get to a congregation. Not everybody's in that situation, but most people are. Then that means we have to do some labor to get to the gathering. And in my particular case, there's actually a lot of labor that's involved in going to congregation most Sabbaths, because I'm on the praise band. And that means I have to carry my guitar, sometimes my music stand, my music folder, the accessories, etc., out to the car, and then into the building once I get there, then set it all up, plug it into the sound system, practice, because that's the day that we have our practice before service, because we can't really seem to, coordinate and get everybody on the team together on another day, like an evening during the week. So we practice during that day. And then, we perform, which is hard work. And then we have to break it all down, put it back in the car, drive it home, take it all out of the car, and take it inside. That's a lot of labor. So some people would look at that and say, whoa, you're breaking the Sabbath. What are you doing? But the fact is, I'm actually not breaking the Sabbath. The reason is the labor is not for me. It's not about building up my kingdom or increasing my station in life. The labor I'm doing is unto the Lord. It's something that needs to be done to facilitate that convocation. How do I know for sure that that's the proper interpretation? Because Yeshua says so. He said when talking to the Pharisees, don't you know that the priests in the temple break Shabbat in order to do their temple service? Every Shabbat, they were laboring. In fact, it was quite heavy labor to do all of the things related to animal sacrifice. You had to carry carcasses and cut things apart and wash things and shovel ashes, etc., etc. There's a lot that went into that. That was definitely labor, but it was okay because they were serving the Lord in the way that he had stipulated. It wasn't about them. It was about the kingdom. By the way, that verse reference is Matthew 12:5. It says, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, yet are guiltless? So that's the really important thing to realize when you're asking yourself various questions about, is this okay and is that okay to do on the Sabbath? You need to ask yourself this question. Is it about me? Is it about my kingdom? Am I building up my situation in life? Am I laboring for my own sake? Or is this all about God and his kingdom? One passage we need to make sure we don't miss is Exodus 35, verse 1 through 3. It says, Moses assembled all the congregation of the people of Israel and said to them, these are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day. This verse has oftentimes been taken out of context and been made to say that you can't make any kind of fire at all on the Sabbath, even turning on a light switch, because that creates a spark. That's how the Orthodox Jews today interpret that verse. You can't even flip a light switch because it could create a spark, and that's kindling a fire. You can't turn on a stovetop, and you couldn't turn on a gas fireplace. But is that really what this means? Definitely not. What's being spoken of here is the process of gathering firewood and kindling and actually lighting a fire so that you can do some kind of work. I mean, we got to remind ourselves what had happened earlier in the book of Exodus. Just after the instructions had been given, a man decided to rebel and he went out and gathered wood on the Sabbath. And Yahweh told Moses, you have to have the whole assembly of Israel stone this man to death. He intentionally and belligerently disobeyed Yahweh in the presence of the whole assembly. He was getting wood so that he could take it into his house, build a fire, and do some kind of labor. This wasn't so that he could stay warm. This was about working. If you've ever gone out and gathered firewood and kindling and actually tried to start a fire with the kind of implements that the Israelites would have had back at the time when these instructions were given, you know that's a lot of work. I've been camping a lot. I know how much work it is to get a fire going, especially without a lighter or matches. And why would they need to anyway? Yahweh had already told them you cook all your food on the day before. You prepare everything you're going to need to eat beforehand so that when you get to the Sabbath, you don't need to cook anything. So if you're building a fire, it's because either you're going to cook food, which you shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath. You're supposed to do that on preparation day, the day before, or you're going to do some other kind of work like smithing or leather working. So this whole idea that you can't turn the ignition of a car because it makes a spark inside your engine is completely ludicrous. That's not at all what Yahweh was talking about. It is not work to turn on your car or to press the pedals down. Let's be reasonable. Yeshua taught us that there's always a principle behind the instructions that God gives. Yes, we are to follow the instructions, but not ultra literally without any consideration of the principle behind it. You can flip on a light switch. It's okay. But can you carry a load from here to there? No, not unless it's for Yahweh. If it's only for the kingdom, then you can carry a load. But if it's something for yourself or for somebody else's enjoyment or their business, no, you can't do that. Take a look at what Jeremiah says in chapter 17, starting at verse 21. This is what Yahweh says. Be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day set apart as I commanded your forefathers. Yet they did not listen or pay attention. They were stiff-necked and would not listen or respond to discipline. But if you are careful to obey me, declares Yahweh, and bring no load through the gates of this city on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day set apart by not doing any work on it, then kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this city with their officials. They and their officials will come riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by the men of Judah and those living in Jerusalem, and this city will be inhabited forever. People will come from the towns of Judah and the villages around Jerusalem, from the territory of Benjamin and the western foothills, from the hill country of the Negeb, bringing burnt offerings and slaughter offerings, grain offerings, incense, and thanks offerings to the house of Yahweh. But if you do not obey me to keep the Sabbath day set apart, by not carrying any load as you come through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortresses. Woo, yikes. That's exactly what happened. I mean, check out 2 Chronicles 36:21. That is exactly what happened. They got the curses, not the blessings. God wants to bless us, and all we have to do is obey his commands. If we do that, his blessing will rain down upon us. But if we decide we can get away with not doing it, then we're going to get the curses. So if you're getting the curses right now, repent and you'll get blessings. So extrapolating out from the principle of this thing, let me just offer my thoughts on a couple of scenarios. What about working out? Some people ask about this. They say, well, I don't really do much physical labor during the week. And I totally relate to that because I sit in front of a computer most of the time. And on my day of rest, I kind of would like to be able to work out. I like to lift weights. I like to jog sometimes. Can I do those things on the Sabbath? Well, I know there are some people who would disagree with me, but I don't think you should be able to do it. And here's why. Because it's about building up your own kingdom. Your body is part of your kingdom. It's the most important thing in your kingdom. I mean, without your body, you can't really have a kingdom here on earth. So when you work out, whether that's biking, lifting weights, doing some kind of cardio, what are you doing? You're putting effort into bettering one of your possessions. On the other hand, if you want to play a game that involves physical activity, you can do that. Why? Because it's about that gathering together. It's part of fellowship. Don't go training for some sort of a game. Like if you're on the football team at school, or you're trying to be a professional athlete, or you are a professional athlete of some sort, then don't train on that day. That goes against the spirit of the Sabbath. But if your friends come over and they want to throw the frisbee around, go ahead, because that's about fellowship and it's rest and recreation. What about cooking? We just talked about how God said you need to prepare your food the day before the Sabbath. So can you cook? No. Cooking is laborious. Making a meal takes a lot of effort. But in this day and age, we have ways of eating meals that really aren't laborious. For instance, we have frozen dinners, and we have Tupperware, and we have refrigerators that we can put food into. So all we have to do is pull something that's already been prepared out of the freezer or the refrigerator and put it in the microwave, or just throw it in the oven. Because clicking a button to turn on the oven, which is electric or gas fed, or clicking a button to turn on a microwave is not work by any stretch of the imagination. So I think, yes, we need to prepare our meals ahead of time or buy them pre-prepared. But on the Sabbath day, is it okay to eat something? Is it okay to warm something up before we eat it? Yeah, as long as we're not building a fire. Like, don't go out and get firewood and chop it up and bring it in and light it and then cook it over that. Where things start to get a little bit gray is when you talk about doing something like putting together a sandwich. Can I have a PB&J sandwich on the Shabbat? Probably. The peanut butter has already been mixed up. It's in a jar just waiting for you to pull it out. Same thing with the jelly. And the bread's probably in a bag. You're not going to make bread on the Shabbat. You're just going to eat bread that you bought at the store beforehand. So I think that's probably okay because you're just taking items that have already been prepared and smashing them together. I personally don't feel convicted in my conscience when I make a PB&J sandwich, or even when I throw some frozen fruit and milk in a blender to make a smoothie. That doesn't seem like laboring to make a meal to me. It just seems like using pre-prepared foods. Hopefully you're getting the picture by now. I'm going to move on to some stickier issues. The first one being, can we make Gentiles work for us on the Sabbath? This is a big one. Amanda and I have a lot of friends that disagree with us on this. They think it's okay to go out to a restaurant or go to a store and buy something on the Sabbath because the Gentiles are out there working regardless, and those people aren't members of our household. Let's remind ourselves of what the commandment says. Don't make any of the animals or the servants or the aliens in your household do any work on the Sabbath. It does say within your gates or in your household. So if people are outside of our gates, then is it okay for us to make them work? My answer to that is no, absolutely not. And here's why. What's the principle behind the law? At the time that the commandment was given, everybody had their own servants. You didn't really go out somewhere else to have a service done for you very often. If you hired workers, it was to come and work on your property, to sow your fields or thresh your harvest, or to take care of things inside the home. The Israelites weren't going to a restaurant and getting someone to serve them there. So it's a different context now. But the principle is, don't make other people work for you. Even the alien, even the foreigner, an alien is a goy. It's one of the goyim or the Gentiles. So we're not to make the Gentiles work for us. And someone will say, yeah, but the Gentiles are going to do it anyway. I mean, it's not like we can control whether or not they work. And I understand that, but you got to think it through. It used to be in America that everything was shut down on Sunday. And then that slowly over time began to change, and businesses decided that they needed to be open on Sundays because they could make money. What I'm getting at here is that you're feeding into the problem. And if every Christian in the nation suddenly stopped going and spending money on Shabbat, do you think the businesses would be open? I don't think so. There's still enough. I mean, it used to be there were plenty of us, but today there are less, but I think still enough Christians in this nation that if everybody stopped spending on Shabbat, businesses would really feel the hit. I think they might reconsider being open on that day because it might not be worth it anymore. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is how you might be confusing people. Because if you're Torah observant and you're wearing tassels and you go into a place on Shabbat and somebody sees those tassels and knows what they mean or asks you what they mean, what are they going to then think? They're going to be very confused, aren't they? They're going to say, wait a minute, if you're following the Old Testament laws, that would include the Sabbath. Why are you here having people work for you on the Sabbath? That would be very confusing to some people. But neither of those arguments is really why you should believe me. I'm going to take you to a scripture that will tell you why you ought to believe me. Turn to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, starting in verse 15. It says this: "In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath.' As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load may be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, 'Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you.' From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath." So what's happening in this passage is that the people had returned to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they had begun doing all of the things that were required by the law, but then they started to backslide, and they started to work on the Sabbath. And one of the things that was happening on the Sabbath is that they were buying wares from these foreigners, like the Tyrians, who were bringing their wares to sell at Jerusalem. Now we can clearly understand why people treading wine presses and bringing in loads of grain, etc., would be a big problem. That's definitely breaking the Sabbath. But why was Nehemiah not letting the merchants in to sell things to the people of Judah? I mean, if it's okay to get Gentiles to work for you, then Nehemiah should have allowed them to come sell, and he simply should have prohibited the Jews from selling their goods. They couldn't be making money. They couldn't be conducting business, but they should have been allowed to buy the goods that the Gentiles were bringing to them, right? But that's not what he was doing. He prohibited the Gentiles from even coming into the city with their goods. He didn't even want them camping around the city during the Sabbath day. Like, get away. This is a sacred day. We don't need you and your merchandise hovering around us. This is very clear to me that this is how the godly people of Judah interpreted the Sabbath command. Now, some people have argued, well, this is just what the Jews did after they returned from Babylon because they had, changed their ideas. Their theology had gotten mixed up a bit when they were in Babylon. It really wasn't required of them to behave that way. And they say this because in the Torah, there's no explicit statement that says you cannot buy things from a Gentile on the Sabbath. But again, there doesn't have to be an explicit statement because it's the principle. The principle is don't make other people work for you. Don't have servants. And if you go out and buy something from somebody, you're making them your servant for a minute. Even if it only takes 30 seconds to do the transaction, they're your servant at that time. When you check out from the grocery store, whoever's checking your items is a servant to you. When you go to a restaurant, the people who are serving you at the restaurant and the people who are cooking your food are your servants. Yes, it's not within your gates, so to speak, but in this day and age, what happens is we carry with us this sort of, bubble or zone of authority. And when we go into a business and we demand for them to give us something or we ask for them to service us, then we're basically saying, you're in my gates. You're under my authority at this moment while we're doing this transaction. Nehemiah was a godly man. In fact, he was a prophet. He has a book of the Bible, guys. He was a prophet. It wasn't like he was doing something that wasn't in line with God's idea about the Sabbath, because if he had been, God would have corrected him. God doesn't let his prophets write down in Scripture things that are not quite right. He only lets them write down things that are totally true in regards to how God's people should be living. So the idea that Nehemiah was, doing some sort of a cultural thing, but it wasn't really biblical, to me is absolute nonsense. This was written for us in the Word of God because it teaches us something about how to live set-apart lives. That was Nehemiah's whole point. He was chastising people. You're not living the set-apart life. You're not behaving holy. And that's there in the Scripture for all eternity for us to refer to and apply to ourselves. Now, where this discussion is going to go next, logically, is don't we always make somebody work for us on the Sabbath, at least in this day and age? And the answer is, yeah, kind of. I mean, if you have your air conditioning on, or you turn on a light, or you use running water, you're utilizing a system which is being run by somebody somewhere. Now, I know a lot of it these days is computerized. And speaking of that, I think it's okay to do something like go to a red box on the Sabbath, because the red box is a machine. I think it's okay to get robots and machines to do things for us on the Sabbath. I have no problem with that. But not everything is automated. So if we're using electricity, somebody has to be at the power plant to run the power plant. If we're using running water, somebody has to be at the water facility. I don't know what you call that, but there are people that have to be working for these things to keep going. So should we just shut everything down on the Sabbath and not use any of those things? Well, maybe. If you want to do that, I applaud you. I think that's going above and beyond. But in my personal opinion, and I can't prove this, I think it's okay, because we're not actively asking them to work for us. We're not really requiring those people to work for us. There's an infrastructure that has to be run 7 days a week. Kind of like hospitals. If you're a medical professional, you're going to have to work on the Sabbath. It's just how it is, because people need medical help on that day like any other day. Babies have to be delivered on that day like any other day. If you're a cop or a fireman, you have to work on the Sabbath sometimes, because those are emergency services. Those are required things. Hospitals need electricity. Firemen need running water. So those utilities have to be run. They have to be manned by employees on the Sabbath like any other day. Also, there are places at certain times of the year that need heating or air conditioning 7 days a week, or people will die. So the utilities have to be run 24/7 for very legitimate reasons, and you and I don't have any say in that. And would it be very noble to not use the services at all on that day? Yes, but am I going to tell my family that they can't have air conditioning on a summer day in Texas? I don't think so. I do not want to cause that kind of pain and suffering. So yeah, we're going to use the AC. And if we're going to use the electricity for the AC, then why don't we just go ahead and use the electricity for the rest of the house too? So that's my personal opinion. And if somebody wants to fight with me on that, okay, I'm up for debating it, and I might change my mind. But just right now, I don't feel bad about it. I don't think God expects us to not utilize those utilities. But here are some things that I won't do on the Sabbath. I'm not going to go to a gas station and go inside and get the person at the counter to take my card or take my cash so that I can have gas. I will go use the automated pump if I have to, but I don't even like to do that. I would rather fill up the car before Sabbath. In fact, I think that's really the right thing to do, is to fill up on the day of preparation, so you don't have to put gas in the car on Sabbath, unless it's an emergency situation, okay? But I have no problem with sitting in a car, because it's not labor. I will travel a good distance in a car, but I won't travel all day in a car and get myself to a place where I have to purchase a hotel room. So for instance, on a Friday, I'm not going to go on a long journey and end up needing a hotel room Friday night. If I'm already in a hotel, that's fine, as long as I don't use the room service or use the cleaning services. So I would put the thing on my door that says, don't disturb. I don't want the cleaning ladies or cleaning people. I shouldn't say cleaning ladies, right? That's not PC. The cleaning people to come in and clean the room, because that's making them work for me on Sabbath. So as long as I can keep anybody at the hotel from doing anything for me, then I'm fine with just being there. Speaking of hotels, we were at a hotel. Amanda and I were at a hotel several years back on a weekend when there were a lot of Jewish people there. And on a couple of occasions, these Jewish ladies asked us to do things for them, like carry their child. It was the weirdest thing. But they wanted us to carry their child. I think it was because the kid didn't want to cross this bridge from one building to another or something. I don't remember, but Yeah, it was a weird request. Really what it does is it shows that you think those people are of less worth than yourself. You think they're lower class citizens. You yourself won't do it, but it's okay if this lesser human being does this thing which God said not to do because they're not a Jew. They're a lesser human being, right? That's prejudiced. I don't agree with that kind of thinking at all. There are probably some other sticky situations that we could talk about, but I want you to think it through. I want you to take the principle and apply it for yourself. That's how the Apostle Paul interpreted the Tanakh. He looked at the spirit behind the law and used that in the context of his current situation. So when he said that an ox shouldn't be muzzled when it treads out the grain, that was a very practical rule in the Torah that needed to be obeyed by anybody who was a farmer, anybody who had oxen treading out grain. But beyond that, that law applied to men of the ministry. They are the oxen in Paul's analogy. Resources should not be withheld from people who are ministering while they're doing that duty for the kingdom of God. They need to be provided for. So Paul was using the principle behind the law to teach something that went beyond the surface application. There may be some of you who are saying, man, I don't know if I can get everything done on the other 6 days of the week. There's just so much to do. There's so much going on. I'm not sure if I can do it. Let me encourage you. You can do it. God will help you. He's helped us. And I also want to encourage you to have enough trust in Yahweh to believe that He will provide for you, even if you pass up opportunities that look really good, so that you can keep the Sabbath set apart. My wife and I have passed up a lot of job opportunities. We passed up the opportunity to create a business because it would have had to have been run on Shabbat. It was a pretty good business idea, I think. Unfortunately, it was the kind of thing that you have to do at festivals and trade shows and these events that always take place on the weekends. It would have been one of those things where you set up a booth, and all of these kinds of venues require you to be open both days of the weekend event. So that wasn't a possibility. After we learned that we would have to be open on Shabbat, we said, nope, we can't start that business. We've passed by things that would have been very valuable, may have brought a lot of money to us because we wanted to obey Yahweh. We wanted to keep the day set apart, as He said. Is Yahweh incapable of taking care of us because we passed up on those opportunities? I hope your answer to that is not yes. I hope you believe that Yahweh is sovereign. I hope you think that He can make anything happen if He wills it. So if we're obeying Him, isn't He going to honor us for that and take care of us regardless? He may not give us vast riches in exchange in this life. He may give us just what we need, and that's it. But trust me, there are riches laid up in heaven. There are rewards that you get for saying no to things while you're on earth because they would cause you to sin. Every man reaps what he sows. Everybody gets what he deserves for all the good things as well as all the bad things. So it's worth it. It's worth it. And even in this life, you're going to be blessed for keeping the Sabbath. It's written, if you turn away your foot from breaking the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my set-apart day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the set-apart day of Yahweh honorable, and shall honor Him, not doing your own ways, not finding your own pleasure, not speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in Yahweh, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of Yahweh has spoken. Isaiah 58:13-14. When Adonai says, your own ways, your own pleasure, your own words, what's He talking about? He's talking about having the focus on us, on our stuff, on our kingdom. If instead we honor Him and His kingdom, then we're going to flourish. Then we're going to be a delight to Yahweh as He is to us. In closing, remember to go check out Reign of the Rebel on Kickstarter. There will be a link in the show notes. But you can also just go to Kickstarter.com and do a search for either my name, Alexander Lawrence, or Reign of the Rebel, R-E-I-G-N, Reign of the Rebel, R-E-B-E-L. And Kickstarter will pull that up for you. There's only about a week left. As of the time of this recording, there's only about a week left on that Kickstarter. So please go check it out immediately so that you don't forget until it's too late. I appreciate you looking at it. All right, that wraps up episode 25 of Searching the Scriptures. Until next time, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Watchman out.